Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
My mum is from the Philippines, and there are many tales of supernatural creatures roaming every stretch of the country. Most sound ludicrous and exaggerated, but none more so than the Duende and the experience I am going to relay. My grandmother kept some chickens and dogs who roamed the grounds, including a pair of turkeys who would wander underneath the house and freak me out as a child. One day, when I was still small enough to walk underneath the house dodging cobwebs and such, I came across some tall, thickly painted red crosses on the stilts and by the high walls surrounding one side of the house. Having never noticed this before, I asked my mum about it, who proceeded to tell me what they were about. To set the scene, it is important to know details about my mum's family home in the farming provincial area of the North Philippines. My grandparents were rice farmers, and my mum and 3 of her siblings lived in the house with them, either studying at university or working in the nearby city in finance. A typical Tagalog house, raised on stilts, was built sometime during the 1950s and had dark mahogany-type floorboards and furniture. The floor where the dining room crosses into the kitchen, however, is made from bamboo and is springy when walked across. There are small gaps in between these whereby you can see down into the ground underneath the house. The whole compound was fairly sized with concrete and brick walls 8 feet high studded with broken glass for security. My mum lived with her other female siblings, and chores always shared, including laundry. No one's clothes were kept separate, and everyone's clothing went into one wash basin. The clothes were then hung on the various clotheslines in the backyard. Her youngest sibling Ella was around 21 at the time and started to notice her underwear missing from the washing line, prominent gaps where panties were supposed to be drying in the sun. Thinking nothing of it, and putting it down to birds or another sibling pulling pranks on her, she learned to ignore it. Weeks passed, and buying knickers was becoming a very expensive habit. Angry and frustrated about the prank, Ella questioned everyone about why they were picking on her, and her underwear only. No one owned up to stealing her panties, with everyone absolutely firm and adamant that it wasn't them, and retorts of why on earth would we do that. Ella grew less angry and just remained frustrated at why it was only her underwear missing from a line of 6 other people. The maids were questioned, and again, firm shakes of heads followed. There was absolutely no reason for the stealing. The knickers were not expensive, and some were full of holes. There was completely no reason as to why they were being taken, and of course to where and for what purpose. The washing was monitored for signs of animals or birds stealing them, and nothing noted. If it was an animal, it would be very clever for them to only know to steal from one particular person. After so many weeks of this happening, my grandfather, having had enough of the whole situation, called a local menghihila, or psychic, to take a look at the house and investigate who or what might be causing the distress. The menghihila took a walk around the compound and immediately picked up that my family weren't the only ones living at that residence. She sat the family down upstairs and revealed that she had discovered a small family of Duende living under the coconut trees, stretching their territory right up to the area underneath the house itself. Everyone was shocked and slightly bewildered, as no one was particularly superstitious. Yes, they had all heard about the little folk as folklore, but never had any connection with them. She mentioned that the Duende were usually tree-living beings, and because they were invisible to people with their third eye closed, only certain people could pick up on their existence. Third eye being the psychic or sixth sense that allows people to see through the veil of our normal world and into another crossover. It is customary in Filipino culture to always say "excuse me" when walking under trees or in long grass to avoid stepping on the creatures. If you do not, the Duende can cast revenge, either making you sick or injured shortly after. There are both good and bad, trickster and malicious Duende. The menghihila was able to see that the culprit of Ella's panty stealing was a Duende of that family living there. She was able to attest to the reason why as well. You see, that particular Duende had a huge crush on Ella and would steal her panties, probably to become noticed or for other unmentionable means. Ella and the family were then led under the house, whereby every single pair of missing panties were found, tightly and nearly folded and stuffed into cracks underneath the house. The menghihila blessed the house with holy coconut oil, and prayers were said to move on the family of Duende. Afterward, it was advised that red crosses were to be painted underneath the house, and white crosses placed in windows to draw away and discourage anything spiritual to reside there again. To this day, the house is still standing, with its fortress of crosses. Who knows whether or not anything managed to slip past the warnings and is residing there currently, dormant, against the will of my family.
In 1999, I was 7 years old, playing in the woods with my friend Charlotte. We were standing at each end of a big log in the woods when I noticed movement in my peripherals. I tried focusing my periphery to catch a detailed look, I see similar movement often when we're in the woods, and always disappears, more like scatters, before I turn to look. My heart skipped a beat when I could make out a group of little people looking up at me as well. I was frozen in the pose I was playing in. After a few seconds I realized Charlotte had stopped narrating our play, and was frozen in place as well, staring at me but focusing on them. I'm pretty sure they were dressed because it didn't look like they were all naked. I could tell they knew we were aware of them, and they dispersed as Charlotte moved her eyes. We didn't talk about it until we were in her house. We weren't afraid, just confused on our walk home. We wrote out what we saw before talking about it to see if we saw the same thing. Unfortunately, both our descriptions were so vague, but clothed less than a foot for sure. One thing we were positive of was to mind our business and to not go searching, which is what our instinct would have usually been. We thought we found a colony of little people in the woods. But the fact that our reaction was to quietly leave and not even talk about it until behind closed doors, and still not even talk out loud but write it. I don't remember being too frightened. In fact, we kind of just accepted it and moved on with a new taste of what this universe is capable of. I watched The Indian in the Cupboard later in life, which reminded me of these little people, but I no longer saw them by then. Charlotte and I would talk about seeing things out of the corner of our eyes, but could never figure out what it was. Although Charlotte was different, her and her dad were huge hippies. Tires swing in the kitchen, no TV, and her imagination was so wildly magnificent that it made my mind radiate. I always thought that maybe her narration of our play was so powerful and energetic that we could manifest and see the same thing. Little people were never playing any parts in either of our imaginations. In fact, when we both confirmed what each other saw, we were kind of in awe that we've never even dreamt of tiny people in this universe.
This is about my native dad, who has had a few supernatural incidents happen to him and the rest of the family in Oklahoma. My father would frequently encounter little people that were no bigger than a pine cone. They are referred to as Minapeds. When he was around 10 years old, he would go fishing in the lake near his childhood home. My grandpa would take him sometimes, but when he was at work or getting treatment in Oklahoma City, he would go alone. The thing about the lake and creeks in the area were the mists that would roll in, not too high, only about a foot off the ground if not less, and would cover most of the area for hours at a time. This particular time he went out fishing, he got closer and closer to the misty edge of the lake. As he approached, he would hear voices. He originally thought it was the wind, but walking further along the path he realized it was definitely voiced. These voices were nothing he could recognize or understand, but definitely dozens of small little voices around him. Feeling a bit frightened, he made his way back home to where my grandma was. He told her about it and she just told him everything was fine. Those voices were Minapeds, and as long as you didn't bother them, they wouldn't bother you. In fact, if you should get lost at the lake, they could help get you home. Still scared, he didn't go fishing that day. The next morning, however, he had put the voices in the back of his mind and set off to go fishing again. Walking down the same old path, he again noticed the mist a foot above the ground and again small little voices. Keeping in mind what Grandma said about not bothering them, he just kept about his business and made it to the edge of the lake. The voices died down a bit and he was able to enjoy fishing in peace. He said he fished for a good 2 hours or so before heading back home and along the path. He again heard the voices. This time, however, along the misty path he would see movement to his left and right as if something small was moving quickly under the mist. He rarely saw a Minaped, but the few times he did see them, he said they were human-like with gray or brown skin and only a few inches tall. When he encountered them again as an adult, he was fishing with my uncle on my mother's side. They went fishing pretty often when I was growing up, several times every summer it seemed. They either went to one of the lakes in the Oklahoma Panhandle area or New Mexico. The one time they went to the Panhandle, they went to a lake close to the one he grew up in that was only 50 or so miles west. There they set out to get on a boat my uncle owned to fish on the lake. But on the way, there was a mist and the sound of little voices. My dad thought nothing of it, but my uncle was starting to get confused, asking if my dad heard voices in the wind. He told him not to worry and that they were just Minapeds, and if he didn't bother them, they wouldn't bother him. Eventually, it freaked my uncle out too much and he convinced my dad to go fish at a lake back west in Texas. He didn't see any that time and I have had yet to see one. I do hope to encounter them though. I mean, if my dad believes they exist even into adulthood, then maybe they do. What do you think? Nonsense or plausible creature yet to be discovered?
One day, back in the 1980s, my twin sister was coming home from cheerleader camp. As they were boarding the bus to come home, she sat at her window seat looking out at the forest. She said something that caught her eye. When she focused in and looked carefully, she said she saw what looked like a leprechaun type of small being. It was peeking out from behind a tree. She said it smiled and winked at her. That is all she remembers. But since we are close twins, as soon as she got home from camp, she was immediately excited to tell me about seeing this strange being.
I'm originally from a small town near Porterville, California. I was visiting my sick grandmother with my 2 small children. It was early 1998. We were sleeping on a sofa bed when I just immediately woke up to this thing standing at the foot of the bed just staring at me. I say he was maybe 3 feet tall. Dirty blonde, shaggy, longish hair. Clothes that looked tattered and slightly dirty. He looked old. His features are a little exaggerated. And by that I mean his nose and ears were really large. His eyes were dark. He had no hat or anything you would associate with a gnome. I was frozen. When my son, 5 years old, sat straight up and screamed, "Hey! A monster!" Of course, I turned to look at my son, then back to the gnome thing, and it was gone. It was so crazy to me. I wasn't sure if it was real or a shared dream. Years later I saw that episode on Monsters and Mysteries and it clicked. Porterville is only about 12 to 15 miles from my grandmother's house. Only difference was the lady in the episode was tormented by it. We were not. Always teased my son that he was a changeling.
My father saw what I can only extrapolate was a gnome, when he was a very young child. When he was a kid around 7 or 9 years old, he suffered very bad night terrors that would wake him up and keep him awake all hours of the night. Sometimes, to calm himself down, he would take his pillow and blankets and make a place to sleep beside his older brother's bed. Well, one night he had a nightmare and went into his brother's room to go to sleep. He got comfortable on the floor, and when he looked under the bed, he saw a man standing there. He said he couldn't have been more than about 3 or 4 inches tall. His skin was white, and his clothes were all green, with a green pointed hat and a long beard. My father told me he emanated with a bright, green light, and when he looked at him, he didn't feel any malice or anything, just confusion at what he was seeing. After a few seconds staring, he said he blinked and it just vanished. My aunt, Dad's sister, had stories of seeing a little woman in her mother's garden, which I can only assume was a fairy of some kind. My father's family are second-generation Irish immigrants. I wonder if such things follow people across the ocean.
As a kid there was an army of gnomes I would play with. One was slightly taller and he was the leader. They were invisible but also blue-colored. Imaginary friends? Yes. But they were almost like that weird phenomena where people create real imaginary friends. They were so real to me. As I got older they stopped appearing to me. As a middle schooler, only the leader would appear to me. He said goodbye to me during a family trip to Disney World. He jumped out the car window. The little dude is somewhere in the Everglades.
I had an experience when I was pretty young, maybe around the age of 6. I woke up in the middle of the night and to my astonishment there were a bunch of what I can only describe as very small gnomes running around everywhere. They were probably only a couple inches in height, and they were almost ethereal, like glowing with a very faint white light. I can't recall their clothes, but they definitely had the classic gnome hats. I was so freaked out that I ran downstairs and tried to wake up my parents. There were so many of them, just running around, almost like a swarm of them or something. They were running up and down the stairs and all around the house, pretty fast too. They didn't really seem to notice me, but I sure noticed them. I don't think I was dreaming as I was awake enough to go downstairs to my parents' room, and I've never had a sleepwalking incident that I can recall. I don't remember much after that besides shaking my mom awake and her escorting me back upstairs, and they were gone by then of course. I never really talked about it because I know how absurd it can sound to people, But damn, that was real as hell for me. I can still picture the little buggers. This was in Minneapolis, Minnesota around 1994. I never saw them again after that.
And Costa Rican and this little people folklore is heavily instilled in children so they don't go running off to become a duende with the forest folk. The last time I visited the country, I was sleeping on the floor and awoke calmly in the middle of the night. At the end of the bed, there was this shadow figure. 2 feet, stocky and robust, just watching me sleep. I didn't feel disturbed or even offended. It felt well guarded and watched over, so I went back to sleep without a second thought. I even invited the duende to stay as long as they'd like. When I later awoke, my dad told me, who was sleeping in the living room, that he was woken up in the middle of the night, and the back patio door in his field of vision from the couch had opened slowly during the middle of the night, and he heard something come in. Emotionally, he responded the same way and just went back to sleep, as if the creature had a connection, relationship, responsibility to be there. At a heart-based level, neither one of us questioned why or how it was there. Later in the trip, we walked around the rainforest, and I swore a Fae had called to me telepathically. I turned to look and my eyes were drawn to a tree. It had a hole on its stump and very obviously looked like a den. There were grass strands right in front of it fluttering, yet no wind. I knew it was the Fae and I came up right to its door, said hello and thank you, then went on my way. This was 5 years ago. Fast forward to this year 2020. I live in Northern California. My apartment is infested with Fae. It was previously rented by older women who had passed away. They fed the alley cats and would always have them over. It held that aura once I moved in. I tried cleansing it, but lo and behold, those spirits were strong and in love with the home, so we lived mutually. In my shower, I constantly saw fluttering lights, dancing around with me. I eventually began offering the Fae anything I could to appease them, simply because they can make the space very buzzy and electric, sometimes an overwhelming feeling. Milk, honey, rum, chocolate, bread, mints, sweets, flowers, stones, and kind words, affirmations were my offerings. I set up a little home for them and would light candles every night to symbolize the warmth and welcoming I was extending. They are certainly mischievous and can be emotionally flustered, what people say is their angry or vengeful side. It seems gnomes and Fae work together. They live in the same median realm and communicate with humans in the same way. Gnomes mind their own business for the most part, but they will garner your attention.
I moved to Texas in 2011 to help my adopted dad. He's deaf and coming up on 90 and a retired master mechanic who used to work on the pipeline. I live in a small cottage next to his house, separated by a fence. My adopted sister spends most of the day with him, and since I'm a nocturnal soul, I spent most of the afternoon and night over there. I'm a retired librarian who reads voraciously, so I spend hours online. Research is something I have a gift for, and the net just makes it easier now. I've always been interested in the supernatural and paranormal. I had a few interesting things happen to me when I was a teen, then a long stretch of mundane life. But since I moved to Texas, a few paranormal things have happened. I blame Texas. I've decided to share the one that has baffled me the most. I consider myself a very pragmatic person. If you're picturing a no-nonsense librarian complete with cardigan, pearls, and those black librarian shoes with sensible heels, that would come close to me, except I have t-shirts, leggings, and flip-flops. I don't indulge in drugs or alcohol and am agnostic. In other words, I don't believe everything I am told or read, and even if I see it happen, I want to be certain of what I saw. I have never hallucinated or fainted in my life, so no head injuries either. We live about 40 miles north of Houston. It used to be mainly country, but the city creeps closer every day. It's a quiet neighborhood and our nearest neighbors are all retired like my dad. Then a very nice Hispanic family moved in across the road from my house, in a couple of mobile homes they set up there. My little house is located on a corner of the property with the main road out to the freeway located on one side, and a road into our neighborhood in front of my house, ending about a mile away in a cul-de-sac. These trailers are about 70 yards away from my front porch. I have clear sight lines as we keep our fence line clean. One late afternoon a couple years ago, I think in August or September, and you have no idea how irritated I am that I did not write down the time or date I have for all the other incidents. I was walking back to my small house from my dad's place to feed my cats. I usually do the evening feed at dusk, so about 5 or 6 o'clock. It was a very pleasant evening. There was no wind. The sun was just sinking behind the tops of the trees, so it was not dark yet. A normal evening. I went through my gate and paused to deadhead a couple of faded blooms from my roses. I have a couple small rose beds in front of my house. So at this point I was standing half hidden from the road, behind a couple of tall rose bushes, facing the road in front of my property and the house trailer across the street. The road is about 30 yards from where I was standing. I remember it being very quiet. The birds had settled, and the insects had not started in with their nightly chorus. Because the sun had just begun to set, it was still light. I wasn't thinking of anything in particular, just standing there plucking faded roses off the bush. Suddenly, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. So, I turned my head to see what it was. I remember hoping it wasn't one of my cats in the road. We don't get much traffic, but I worry about them because people are always dumping strays here. At first it looked like a black, plastic garbage bag blowing briskly in a straight line down the road. Have you ever seen a black plastic bag that has blown off a burn pile, like for autumn leaves? That. It looked thin and kind of oily as it tumbled end over end down the street, just an innocent black plastic bag blowing along. Then I realized that there was absolutely no wind or breeze, so I just stared closer, puzzled. If there was no wind, how was it moving so fast? Then the most amazing thing happened. As I watched, the bag morphed, and that is the only word that properly describes what I saw, and elongated into the form of a lanky, sleek black cat trotting down the side of the road. I don't own a black cat. Then, as I watched that, the cat changed in a blink into the form of a small, naked black, male figure about a foot tall at the most. By this time, it had reached the edge of my neighbor's yard. Also, by this time, I am sure I looked like an idiot standing there with my jaw dropped in amazement, behind the bushes. As I stared, the little man abruptly glanced across the road and saw me looking back. The second he realized that I could see him, he startled, turned and jumped the ditch into my neighbor's yard and just dove into the ground and disappeared. When I say dove into the ground, that is exactly what happened. There was no hole there. The dry, flat yard had just been mowed. He, or it, just dove headfirst like a diver into the earth and was gone. I just stood there wondering if I was having a hallucination or if I'd finally gone nuts. I remember walking into my house and locking the door behind me. I think I was kind of in shock, because as I mentioned, I forgot to write down the date and time, and that is totally unlike me because I keep a daily journal. My brain was in full WTF mode, trying to figure out what the heck I just saw. I thought about it for days and finally told my best friend and my sister, and now you guys, about this. It was a small, coal-black male with a full head of glossy, curly hair. It was stark naked and obviously male. It was at most a foot tall. The impression I got was of a little guy returning home from some errand or visit, carefree. What was he? Was he a duende, an earth spirit, a nahual, an imp or goblin of some sort? Does he use the plastic bag and cat forms as daily camouflage? I have no clue. I have not seen him since, nor has he trespassed onto my property. Perhaps because of my cats. Is he attached to the neighbors as a household spirit? Had he moved here with them? I still research and see if I can find out more. I am still puzzled over this. I went and looked closely the next day at the place I saw him vanish, and it was perfectly normal. I did not say anything to my neighbors because they have kids, and I didn't want to frighten them or to come across as the neighborhood Looney Tune. Only 2 small incidents have happened that make me wonder if the little creature was involved. Last summer, my neighbor's water pipes suddenly sprouted holes and he had geysers of water erupting out of his yard in various odd spots. He had to call the county water works to fix them. Also, one evening I heard a clatter on my front porch and came out with a broom ready to evict the local porch possum or raccoon, and found all of my cat's food bowls neatly stacked in a pyramid shape on my front sidewalk. Was it the little man playing a prank? Who knows? I still think about this. I consider myself a rational, insane human being, and I admit, I've always been curious about paranormal events, but I never ever thought I would witness one. Well, that is my story. I have no family to document or leave this story to, and it's amazing to me, so I thought you might like it. Feel free to share this. All I ask is that you do not use my name.
When I was younger, I saw something in an older house in Midtown Sacramento, California that I still can't explain. This house belonged to the couple who would babysit me when my mom would have to work a closing shift at the diner she worked at. Most visits to the babysitters were unremarkable. I remember that the husband had a whole room devoted to model trains and that they were nice people who treated me well. I never minded having to go over there. Usually, my mom would show up pretty late at night to come pick me up. So the female babysitter would put me to sleep on some cushions on the floor of the living room, and she'd fall asleep on the couch right above me. This particular night, I couldn't fall asleep. This is still fairly common for me. I don't fall asleep easily in silence and darkness, and was just kind of lying there and staring at the wall in the dark. Along this wall, there was a table or a desk of some sort, I remember. So I was staring at this general spot, not sleeping, when I saw this grayish humanoid shape kind of glide or slide out from under the table and stand before me. It was too dark to really see details or colors. All I remember was that it was about 2 or 3 feet tall and appeared to either be holding a spear or sword or perhaps wearing a pointy hat. I remember being terrified and hiding my face under the covers for some time. Eventually, I heard a faint swishing sound and I looked to see the figure was gone. I shook my babysitter awake and told her that I'd seen a ghost, and she told me I was dreaming and to go back to sleep. The thing is, I hadn't been sleeping. To this day, I have no idea what I saw. In Sacramento, I have heard stories of creatures called duendes or duendes, but most sightings are dismissed as possums, which makes sense. Anyone else ever see anything like this or have heard of anything like this? What did I see that night? Ghost, goblin, duende? A possum with a spear?
I've seen something I can only assume was a fairy, elf, or the like. We, friend, mum, and me, were house sitting in this beautiful condo in the forest. This forest was no doubt magical in some way, it just had an energy to it. We were having breakfast one morning and I suddenly saw a small person, the size of a 6-year-old child, run through the field next to the house. It disappeared behind a tree that was too thin for it to hide behind. My friend and my mum were sitting opposite of me, so they didn't catch it. I tell my mum that I saw something, and she says, I think I saw it too a few days ago. My friend suggests we both move to a different room and draw what we had seen to compare. Mind you, so far we only know that we both saw something run across the field, not what it looked like. My mum and I both drew the exact same creature. A small human with adult proportions, so not a child. It was dressed in all white clothes that looked like pajamas. My encounter had looked my way and smiled/laughed, my mum's face turned away. It was wearing a long nightcap that trailed behind it. It was faster than a human that size could reasonably be. We called the owner of the house and said we saw a spirit in the field. She says, oh, the fairy in white, huh? Yeah. It's attached to that tree out front, the thin one. That's the wedding tree my husband and I planted when we got married. It had no bad vibes. I think it might have been the protector of the tree. We haven't seen it since.
An old girlfriend and I saw fairies while on a walk on a nature trail quite a few years ago. Not a normal cryptid sighting, and yes, I'm very serious. No, they weren't fireflies, we weren't high, and it wasn't a passing glimpse. There were fairies, a whole swarm of them, idly floating about in a bush on the side of the path. We watched them for almost 10 minutes, sort of knowing without discussing it that we shouldn't make any noise, interrupt or interact, or try to retrieve our other friends back up the path. We stood there in the moment, until we realized there was nothing else for it, and left them to walk back to our group.
Weird story. My dad claimed to have seen a leprechaun once, or at least that's the best way to describe it. Apparently he was driving late at night back home, rural England, and a taxi cab happened to be going in the same direction a few car lengths ahead. These roads are notoriously windy and have high inclines and down lines. Very dangerous, and if you're not used to them you could crash. As the cab went past one of the many bushes on the side, the being hopped out of the sides and onto the back bumper. Luckily his turn came up and he managed to avoid whatever the hell that was.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.